It begins with a cup of tea. It is perhaps the most defining symbol of British identity, a ritual of comfort, civility, and domestic order. In the mid-19th century, the British Empire was the undisputed master of the oceans and the forge of the Industrial Revolution. Its factories clothed the world, its navy policed the seas, and its banks in London managed the flow of global capital. But this colossal empire had a weakness, a fatal dependency that terrified the governors of the Bank of England more than any French army or Russian fleet. The British public was addicted to tea, and that addiction was bankrupting the nation. To understand the violence that would eventually erupt on the Pearl River, one must first look not at a map of forts and batteries, but at a ledger. By the 1830s, the demand for Chinese tea in Britain had become insatiable. It was no longer a luxury for the aristocracy. It was the fuel of the working class, the staple of every breakfast table, from the slums of Manchester to the palaces of Westminster. Every year, millions of pounds of tea were shipped from Canton to London. But this trade was dangerously one-sided. The Qing dynasty, the ancient and inward-looking rulers of China, had almost no interest in British goods. They did not need Sheffield cutlery. They had no use for Manchester cottons. They regarded British woolens as uncomfortable and strange. The Qianlong Emperor had famously declared to a British envoy years earlier that China possessed all things in abundance and had no need for the manufactures of outside barbarians. This arrogance was backed by economic reality. The Chinese merchants at Canton, the only port open to foreign trade, refused to accept British products as payment. They demanded silver. Only silver, pure and heavy, was accepted in exchange for the tea, silk and porcelain that flowed west. For decades, the ships of the East India Company sailed to China, laden with silver bullion, emptying the treasury of Great Britain. It was a hemorrhage of wealth on a terrifying scale. The balance of trade was catastrophic. The British Empire was effectively paying a rival civilization to keep its own population caffeinated. By the late 18th century, the situation had become unsustainable. The supply of silver was finite, and the price of tea was rising. The directors of the East India Company, a corporate entity with its own army and the power to make war, faced a stark choice. They could accept financial ruin and the collapse of the lucrative China trade, or they could find a commodity that the Chinese people wanted as badly as the British wanted tea. They needed a product that created its own demand. They needed something addictive. The answer lay in the poppy fields of Bengal. The East India Company controlled vast swathes of India, where the climate was perfect for the cultivation of opium. For centuries, opium had been used in China medicinally, a small-scale indulgence for the wealthy. But the British saw an opportunity to industrialize this vice. If they could flood the Chinese market with high-grade, affordable opium, they could reverse the flow of silver. The Chinese would pay for the drug in silver, and that silver would remain in British hands to pay for the tea. It was a triangular trade of cold, calculated brilliance and profound moral bankruptcy. The plan worked with devastating efficiency. In the early 1800s, the East India Company established a monopoly on opium production in India. They processed the sap into sticky black balls, stamped them with the company's seal, and auctioned them in Calcutta to private smugglers. These smugglers, often sailing fast, heavily armed clipper ships, would race the cargo to the Chinese coast. Officially, the East India Company washed its hands of the crime. They merely sold the product in India. What happened after the auction was not their legal responsibility. It was a veneer of corporate deniability that allowed the British government to profit from a trade that was illegal in China. By 1830, the trickle of opium had become a flood. The impact on Chinese society was immediate and horrific. The foreign mud, as it was called, devastated the coastal cities. Men sold their land, their homes, and even their children to feed the pipe. The productivity of the workforce collapsed. The Chinese army, once the terror of Central Asia, saw its soldiers withering away in opium dens, their matchlocks pawned for a few more ounces of the black smoke. But for the British Treasury, the crisis was over. The silver was flowing back. The trade deficit had vanished. The books were balanced. But the stage was set for a collision between two empires that would change the world forever. The Qing emperor in Beijing could no longer ignore the rot eating away at the heart of his kingdom. He was about to appoint a man of iron will to stop the flow. A man who believed that moral righteousness was stronger than British gunpowder. In the Forbidden City, the Daoguang emperor was faced with a stark choice: legalize the drug and tax it, or eradicate it completely. He chose eradication. To execute this colossal task, he turned to Lin Zexu, a scholar official of immense reputation. Lin was a man of the old school, highly educated, deeply Confucian, and most dangerously for the British smugglers, utterly incorruptible. He was known as Blue Sky Lin, a nickname symbolizing a politician as clear and pure as the heavens. In the winter of 1838, the emperor invested him with supreme powers and sent him south to Canton with a simple mandate: cut off the fountain of poison. Lin Zexu arrived in Canton in March 1839, not with a whimper, but with a thunderclap. The city of Canton, or Guangzhou, was the only point of contact between China and the West. It was a place of tenuous coexistence, where British merchants lived in a designated strip of warehouses known as the 13 Factories. For years, these merchants had operated with impunity, bribing local mandarins to look the other way as the opium clippers unloaded their cargo at the mouth of the Pearl River. They viewed Chinese law as a nuisance, a set of archaic rules that could always be circumvented with enough silver. They assumed Commissioner Lin would be just another bureaucrat looking for a larger bribe. They were wrong. Within days of his arrival, Lin arrested thousands of Chinese opium dealers and addicts. He forced addicts to surrender their pipes and undergo painful withdrawals. But he knew that arresting the users was like cutting the leaves off a weed. He had to destroy the root. He turned his attention to the 13 Factories. On March 18, 1839, Lin issued an ultimatum to the foreign merchants: surrender all opium stores immediately and sign a bond swearing never to smuggle the drug again on pain of death. The British merchants, led by the Superintendent of Trade, Captain Charles Elliot, stalled. They offered to hand over a token amount, a few thousand chests, hoping to appease this zealous new official. Lin's response was swift and terrifying. He did not send in soldiers to slaughter them. He simply stopped the clock. He ordered the withdrawal of all Chinese servants, cooks, and linguists from the factories. He placed the foreign quarter under total lockdown. Troops surrounded the compound, and a cordon of boats blocked the river. The wealthiest traders in the world, men who lived like princes, suddenly found themselves trapped in their warehouses without fresh water, food, or labor. They were hostages in their own counting houses. For 6 weeks, the siege held. The British dignity crumbled under the reality of thirst and mounting filth. Finally, Captain Elliot surrendered. He ordered the merchants to hand over their entire stock, promising that the British government would compensate them for their loss. It was a staggering amount of contraband, over 20,000 chests of opium, worth millions of pounds sterling. Lin Zexu had won, or so it seemed. He ordered the opium to be transported to Humen, near the Bogue forts guarding the river. He did not burn the opium, lest the fumes intoxicate the onlookers. Instead, he dug 3 massive trenches, filled them with water, salt, and lime. The chemical reaction boiled the opium into a useless sludge, which was then flushed out to sea. As the sludge drifted away, Lin composed a poem to the sea spirit, apologizing for polluting the ocean with such filth. It was a moment of supreme moral victory for the Qing dynasty. They had stood up to the barbarians and enforced their law without firing a shot. But in London, the mood was not one of contrition. It was one of outrage. When news reached Parliament, the destruction of the opium was framed not as a rightful law enforcement action against drug smuggling, but as a violation of property rights and an insult to the British Crown. The powerful lobbies of the textile industry and the India trade clamoured for war. They argued that if China could seize British property at will, no trade was safe. The moral ugliness of the opium was swept under the rug. The debate was shifted to the sanctity of free trade and national honour. Lord Palmerston, the Foreign Secretary, penned a letter demanding reparations and the opening of more ports. He did not send a diplomat to deliver it. He sent the Royal Navy. In the summer of 1840, a fleet of warships, transports, and something entirely new, steam-powered gunboats, gathered in the waters off Macau. Lin Zexu had prepared for a war of the past, reinforcing his coastal batteries to fight wooden sailing ships. He had no concept of the industrial fury that was about to descend upon his country. The First Opium War had begun. When the British Expeditionary Force arrived, it brought with it a weapon that belonged to the future. Among the majestic wooden ships of the line, with their towering masts and acres of canvas, there sat a strange, low-slung vessel that vomited black smoke. It was the HMS Nemesis. To the eyes of the Qing defenders watching from the shore, it must have looked like a monster. It was the first British ocean-going iron warship, a flat-bottomed paddle steamer designed specifically for the shallow, muddy waters of China's rivers. The Chinese Navy was composed of war junks, wooden vessels that had remained largely unchanged for centuries. They were sturdy, armed with brass cannons, and manned by brave sailors, but they were slaves to the wind and the tide. If the wind died, the junk was a sitting duck. The Nemesis had no such master. Powered by a 120 horsepower steam engine, it could sail against the wind, against the current, and into the shallowest inlets, where no heavy European warship had ever dared to go. The collision of these two eras occurred on January 7, 1841, at the Second Battle of Chwempi. The British fleet moved to force the entrance to the Pearl River. As the wooden ships engaged the forts, the Nemesis, commanded by Captain William Hall, unleashed its horror. Ignoring the exchange of cannon fire, the iron ship simply motored past the stationary British line and drove straight toward the fleet of 15 Chinese war junks anchored in the shallows of Anson's Bay. The Chinese commanders watched in disbelief. They had assumed the shallow water was their shield. Suddenly, this iron beast was among them. The Nemesis did not just rely on cannon. It carried Congreve rockets, screeching, erratic incendiary devices that terrified troops as much as they killed them. Captain Hall ordered a rocket fired at the largest junk. The projectile hissed across the water and struck the wooden vessel's magazine. The explosion was cataclysmic. The junk disintegrated in a blinding flash of timber and bodies, sending a mushroom cloud of smoke into the sky. It was a sight that signaled the end of thousands of years of Chinese naval tradition. In minutes, the Nemesis moved down the line, pouring canister shot and rockets into the helpless wooden fleet. The Chinese sailors fought back with muskets and arrows, their shots pinging harmlessly off the iron hull. It was not a battle, it was an industrial slaughter. By the end of the morning, the Chinese fleet had ceased to exist. But the horror of the Nemesis was not just its firepower, it was its reach. As the war progressed, the steamer ventured deep inland, navigating the intricate network of canals and tributaries that fed the great cities of the Delta. It appeared like a ghost in quiet farming villages hundreds of miles from the sea, towing boats filled with redcoats and Royal Marines. The psychological impact was devastating. The Devil Ship, as the locals called it, proved that nowhere was safe. The Great Wall could not stop it. The river forts could not sink it. This technological mismatch extended to the infantry war on land. The Qing army, the Banner troops, were armed with matchlock muskets, weapons that required a soldier to manually light a fuse before firing. In the damp, humid climate of southern China, these weapons were notoriously unreliable. Against them stood the British regular, armed with the percussion-cap musket, the Brown Bess, updated with a mechanism that fired instantly and reliably, even in the rain. At the Battle of Canton, the British demonstrated the ruthless efficiency of modern drill. While the Qing troops charged with brave, disorganized fervor, waving banners and clashing gongs to intimidate the enemy, the redcoats stood in silent, perfect lines. They waited until the Chinese were within killing range, and then, at the drop of a sword, unleashed rolling volleys of lead. The discipline that had broken Napoleon's columns in Europe now tore through the silk tunics of the bannermen. The war was rapidly revealing itself to be less of a conflict and more of a collision between a sledgehammer and a vase. The British were not just winning, they were dismantling the myth of Chinese invincibility, one battle at a time. And as the news of these defeats drifted north to Beijing, the emperor's confusion turned to panic. He fired Lin Zexu, exiling the incorruptible commissioner to the desolate frontier of Xinjiang, blaming him for provoking a beast he could not kill. With Lin Zexu exiled and the Pearl River under blockade, the British commanders made a cold strategic calculation. Burning coastal villages and sinking junks in the south was effectively meaningless to the emperor in Beijing, thousands of miles to the north. China was too vast to be conquered by a few thousand men. To win this war, the British didn't need to capture territory, they need to strangle the economy. They looked at the map and identified the empire's jugular vein, the Grand Canal. This colossal man-made waterway was the lifeline of the Qing dynasty, transporting millions of tons of grain and tax revenue from the fertile rice paddies of the south to the imperial capital in the north. If the British could sail up the coast, enter the great Yangtze River, and seize the intersection of the river and the Grand Canal, Beijing would starve. The decision was made. The expeditionary force weighed anchor and sailed north, leaving the tropical heat of Canton for the unknown waters of the East China Sea. Their first target was the island of Jushan, guarding the approach to the Yangtze. The capture of the island's capital, Dingai, offered a surreal glimpse into the collision of two alien worlds. The British bombardment shattered the medieval walls, and the redcoats stormed the city, expecting fierce resistance. Instead, they found a population largely bewildered by these red-clad demons. The occupation that followed was a bizarre tableau of Victorian military life superimposed onto ancient China. Diaries from the 18th Royal Irish Regiment describe soldiers quartered in ornate Buddhist temples, using the limbs of gilded statues as racks for their muskets and drying their laundry on the arms of incense burners. Officers set up their mess tables in the courtyards of ancestral halls, toasting the Queen with looted rice wine, while giant stone dragons stared down at them. But while the British could easily defeat the Qing garrisons, they found themselves under attack by a far more lethal enemy, the Chinese landscape itself. The British had arrived in the height of summer. The humidity was suffocating. The troops, still wearing their thick red wool tunics and high leather stocks designed for European parades, began to drop like flies. It was not matchlock bullets that filled the field hospitals. It was dysentery, malaria, and heat stroke. The Jushan fever swept through the camp. Regiments that had stormed the beaches with 700 men were reduced to a few dozen fit for duty within weeks. The British army was rotting from the inside out, camped in a city of strange gods and bad water. Meanwhile, a dangerous fog of misinformation was settling over the forbidden city. The Qing generals, terrified of the emperor's wrath, began to fabricate reports. When the British withdrew from a town due to sickness or lack of supplies, the generals reported a glorious victory. They claimed to have sunk the devil ships with magical incantations or underwater stakes. The Daoguang emperor, reading these reports in the seclusion of his palace, was led to believe that the barbarians were on the run. He ordered his commanders to exterminate the remaining invaders, unaware that the British were not fleeing but simply regrouping. This disconnect between reality and the imperial court was catastrophic. It prevented the Qing from seeking a diplomatic solution when they still had some leverage. Instead, the war dragged on, fueled by the emperor's delusion that victory was imminent. But the British had recovered from the fever. Reinforced with fresh troops from India, sepoys who were more acclimated to the heat, and fresh supplies of quinine, the expeditionary force prepared to deliver the death blow. They turned their prows toward the Yangtze River. They were done with skirmishes. They were going to strike at the heart of the empire's wallet. The target was the great city of Zhenjiang, the gateway to the Grand Canal, and the site of the war's most desperate and tragic stand. July 1842. The British fleet, a terrifying armada of 70 ships, anchored off the walls of Zhenjiang. This city was the choke point of the Qing economy. If Zhenjiang fell, the Grand Canal would be blocked, and the flow of grain to Beijing would stop instantly. The emperor would be ruling a capital of starving ghosts. The defense of the city fell to the Manchu bannermen, the elite hereditary warriors of the Qing dynasty. Unlike the demoralized conscripts on the coast, these men were fighting for their very existence. They were commanded by General Haling, a man who had watched the incompetence of his fellow generals with disgust. He locked the gates, burned the boats, and swore that the red-haired barbarians would only enter his city over his corpse. When the British attack began on the morning of July 21st, the heat was already oppressive. The redcoats, sweating through their wool, rushed the walls with scaling ladders. They expected the defenders to fire a few loose volleys and flee, as they had done so often before. Instead, they were met with a wall of disciplined fire and cold steel. For the first time in the war, the British found themselves in a ferocious hand-to-hand struggle. Manchu soldiers grappled with the invaders on the ramparts, dragging them off the ladders and wrestling them to their deaths in the moats below. The fighting spilled into the streets of Zhenjiang, becoming a confused, bloody house-to-house brawl. But superior British firepower, the relentless discipline of the line, and the devastating canister shot from the artillery slowly ground the defenders down. By the afternoon, the city was lost. General Haling, seeing the British flag rising over the gates, retreated to his command post. He sat down on a pile of official papers and wood, lit a match, and burned himself alive. But the horror was just beginning. As the British troops moved deeper into the Manchu quarters to secure the city, they were met with a silence more terrifying than the roar of battle. They kicked open the doors of the houses, expecting to find cowering civilians. Instead, they found entire families dead by their own hands. Mothers had hung their children from the rafters before hanging themselves. Fathers had cut the throats of their wives and daughters to save them from the disgrace of capture by the foreign devils. It was a scene of mass ritual suicide on a scale the British soldiers could barely comprehend. Hardened veterans of the Napoleonic Wars wept openly as they walked through streets that had become open-air morgues. The victory at Zhenjiang was absolute, but it was hollowed out by the sheer scale of the human tragedy. The Grand Canal was blocked, the thousands of grain barges that fed Beijing backed up for miles, their cargo rotting in the summer sun. The jugular had been cut. The Daoguang emperor, finally stripped of his delusions by the stoppage of the grain tribute, capitulated. He sent his negotiators to the deck of the British flagship, the HMS Cornwallis, anchored off the city of Nanking. They were there to sign a peace, but in reality, they were there to sign the death warrant of the old world. On August 29, 1842, the Treaty of Nanking was signed. It was the first of what history would call the unequal treaties. The terms were dictated by the British gunboat commanders, and they were humiliating. China was forced to pay an indemnity of 21 million silver dollars, a staggering sum intended to cover the cost of the war and, cruelly, to compensate the British smugglers for the opium Lin Zexu had destroyed years earlier. The emperor was essentially forced to pay for the drugs his country had refused to buy. Furthermore, the treaty abolished the canton system. No longer could China dictate where and how foreigners traded. 5 treaty ports, Canton, Amoy, Fuzhou, Ningbo, and Shanghai, were thrown open to British residents and trade. In these ports, British citizens would be subject only to British law, a concept known as extraterritoriality. A British merchant could beat a Chinese labourer to death on the docks of Shanghai and be tried only by a British judge, likely receiving a mere fine. It was a complete erosion of Chinese sovereignty. But the most lasting scar on the Chinese map was Article 3. The treaty stated that the island of Hong Kong would be ceded to the British Crown in perpetuity. At the time, Hong Kong was a barren rock with a few fishing villages, a pirate haven that the British Foreign Secretary Lord Palmerston dismissively called a barren island with hardly a house upon it. Yet this rock would become the forward operating base of the British Empire in the east, a deep-water harbour that would project Royal Navy power into the heart of Asia for the next 150 years. Remarkably, the Treaty of Nanking made no explicit mention of opium. The drug remained technically illegal in China. But with the opening of the ports and the crushing of the Chinese Customs Authority, the trade exploded. The British had not legalized the drug. They had simply smashed the door off its hinges so that no one could stop it entering. The foreign mud poured into Shanghai and the new treaty ports by the ton, fueling a social catastrophe that would weaken the Qing dynasty until it could no longer stand. The war was over, but the peace was a fragile illusion. The British felt the Chinese were stalling on the treaty terms, while the Chinese populace grew increasingly hostile to the foreigners strutting through their streets. The resentment simmered for a decade, fueled by the humiliating presence of the gunboats and the growing army of addicts, until it boiled over again. The First Opium War had opened China, but it hadn't broken it. That would require a second war, a second invasion, and an act of cultural vandalism so profound it is remembered with bitterness to this day. Peace lasted less than 15 years. The insatiable demand for opium in China and the insatiable demand for trade access in Britain made a second conflict inevitable. In 1856, a minor diplomatic squabble over a registered ship, the Arrow, provided the pretext for war. But this time, the British did not come alone. The French joined the expedition, eager for their share of the spoils. In 1860, a joint Anglo-French army marched on Beijing, shattering the last remnants of the Qing army at the Battle of Palikao. The emperor fled to the north, leaving the capital defenseless. As the foreign armies camped outside the walls of Beijing, a diplomatic disaster unfolded. A British negotiation team, led by Harry Parkes, was seized by Qing officials during a parley. They were imprisoned and subjected to horrific medieval tortures in the Board of Punishments. When the survivors were finally released, they were barely recognizable. Many others had died in agony. Their bodies returned in a condition that sickened the British command. Lord Elgin, the British High Commissioner, demanded retribution. He wanted to leave a mark that would permanently scar the Qing prestige without harming the ordinary citizens of Beijing. He turned his eyes to the northwest of the city, to the Yuanming Yuan, the old summer palace. The Yuanming Yuan was not merely a palace, it was a wonder of the world. Covering hundreds of acres, it was a complex of gardens, lakes, temples, and palaces that housed the artistic heritage of the Qing dynasty. It contained libraries of priceless manuscripts, halls filled with jade and porcelain, and European-style palaces designed by Jesuit missionaries. It was the private paradise of the emperors, a place of supreme beauty and tranquility. On October 18, 1860, Lord Elgin gave the order. 3,500 British troops marched into the gardens with torches. For 3 days, the sky over Beijing turned black with the smoke of burning history. The soldiers smashed porcelain vases to test their rifles, draped themselves in the emperor's silk robes, and stuffed their pockets with jewels. What they couldn't steal, they destroyed. The wooden pagodas, dry as tinder, erupted into infernos. The frantic screams of the palace eunuchs and maids, trapped in the burning buildings, were drowned out by the roar of the flames. When the smoke finally cleared, the Garden of Gardens was a scorched wasteland of broken stone and ash. Only the marble skeletons of the European-style palaces remained standing, ghostly ruins that still stand today as a monument to the destruction. It was an act of calculated cultural annihilation. Lord Elgin wrote in his diary that he wanted to hit the emperor in his pride as well as his power. He succeeded. The destruction of the Summer Palace broke the spirit of the Qing court completely. The gates of Beijing were thrown open, and the victors marched in to dictate the final terms of surrender. The Convention of Peking, signed in late 1860, was the final nail in the coffin of the old order. It ratified the previous unequal treaties and added new, harsher humiliations. The Kowloon Peninsula was ceded to Britain to expand Hong Kong. Christian missionaries were granted the right to travel and preach anywhere in the interior, eroding the traditional Confucian social structure. But the most significant clause was the one that finally closed the iron ledger. The opium trade was legalized. After 20 years of war, bombardment, and diplomacy, the British Empire had achieved its primary economic goal. The drug that Lin Zexu had tried to wash into the sea was now a legal, taxable commodity. The foreign mud flooded into every province of China without restriction. The social consequences were apocalyptic. By the late 19th century, it is estimated that 10% of the Chinese population was addicted to opium. The sick man of Asia was not just a metaphor for a weak government. It was a literal description of a population hollowed out by narcotics. The silver flow reversed again. The wealth of China drained away into the coffers of the British banks and the great trading houses of Hong Kong and Shanghai. Companies like Jardine Matheson, whose fortunes were built on the drug trade. The Qing dynasty, delegitimized by its inability to protect its people, began a slow, agonizing death spiral. It would face massive internal rebellions, further foreign incursions, and eventually, revolution. For Britain, the Opium Wars were a triumph of free trade and a masterclass in gunboat diplomacy. The victors wrote the history books, framing the conflict as a necessary step in opening a backward nation to the modern world. In London, the immense profits from the China trade funded railways, factories, and the Victorian Golden Age. The moral cost was conveniently ignored, buried under the rhetoric of progress and civilization. But in China, the memory of the wars became the bedrock of modern nationalism. The period from the First Opium War in 1839 to the founding of the People's Republic in 1949 is known as the Century of Humiliation. It is a narrative of victimhood and resilience that shapes Chinese foreign policy to this day. Every schoolchild in China learns about the burning of the Summer Palace and the heroism of Lin Zexu. The Opium Wars remain a dark mirror held up to the history of the British Empire. They reveal the ruthless economic machinery that drove imperial expansion, a system where the balance of trade was more sacred than the welfare of a civilization, and where a drug cartel could fly the flag of a superpower. The ledger was balanced, the tea was secured, and the empire grew richer. But the smoke from the Summer Palace cast a shadow that has never truly faded. Thank you for listening to our story. If you found this history as fascinating as we did, please like this video and subscribe to British War History for more. We read all of your comments, so be sure to leave your thoughts below. We'll see you in the next video.